The smaller countries should actually explicitly not have any guarantees. Now the question is, how do we commit future governments never to bail out small institutions?
Institutions is another matter. Well, there's a problem there. You give a guarantee today, and in 3 years' time, when a crisis hits, what was a small firm suddenly becomes a big one, and you need to update all this all the time. And the other point was about regulation, and this, of course, is being wise after the event, of course, because this should have been said before the crisis came, that there should be adequate regulation. And that will come. Whether it's adequate is another matter. It'll come through Basel III, which is a bit questionable, I think, probably, and other agreements on international bank regulations. So part of the problem is that this is an international problem. So it's no good one country guaranteeing something and the problem occurs in a bank in another country who's got large operations than the one we're talking about. So you have to have agreement on that. But the question of regulation, and it may or may not, it depends who you're talking to, involve separating retail banking from investment banking, which being, the second being more speculative. That's a big debate in London.
Going back to the Glass-Steagall.
Well, yeah, right. It has echoes of the Glass-Steagall arrangements in the US, and there are plenty of people pushing for that. My colleague in Scotland, John Kay, is on if you read the FT, you've seen his columns on this. So there's that sort of thing. So there's all sorts of stuff to be worked out, still to be worked out, on what's an adequate regulation system. I can't claim great expertise on that, but it clearly has to be done, and on an internationally agreed basis. And then if people, the banks, whoever, don't like it, they may well emigrate to the Cayman Islands or Bermuda or somewhere like that, and then they go bust.
Well, they can't come to Australia.
Well, they can come to Australia if they like.
No, they can't. I'm afraid.
Anyway, so I mean that's the other issue. In all of that, you realise that working out exactly what regulations you want and what can be allowed and what cannot be allowed requires a great deal of detailed work. And all the PhD physicists who get employed in the financial markets by the big banks inventing new financial derivatives, you need every bit as many of those sorts of people in the regulators, because the moment you put regulations on, the banks and the investment people will look for ways to wriggle around those regulations and develop new markets. And so they should. So you need the regulators to keep pace with that, and that, of course, is not easy. So this is not okay, we come up with a new regulation, zap, that's the end of the problem. This is an ongoing thing.
So you're suggesting that these guys are studying the wrong degree. They should convert from economics to physics and get their financial bonuses.
No. Well, the one thing I noticed in reading, and this is not serious reading, they're reading just the accounts by the people involved in these markets, is when they invent these wonderful new derivatives of the kind which triggered the crisis, they are very surprised that there's a crisis, because when they've looked at the problem, the derivative they're inventing and the mathematics behind it and so on, what they're doing is they're assuming that they're the only one who's going to buy this or sell this, right? So there's only one operator in the market. The rest of the markets are doing whatever they always used to do. And then, of course, it makes perfect sense. You can make money on it. It's a logical thing that you'd want to do, and it provides a service either for you or the person to whom you're selling the derivative. But the problem is, if everybody does it all at once, then you can get the most terrible interactions going on, and you can cause the whole market to collapse. And they, of course, are not required to think about the rest of the market. They're only required to think about their own bank. And so the regulation is actually much more to do with the spillover effects or constraining the herd behavior or something of this kind than it is about the detailed mathematics of one particular derivative. Right.
Now you touched on the various kind of driving forces behind the problems of some of the countries. Now it seems to expose the inherent problem in a currency union that one size fits all monetary policy is not really true. I mean, you talked about the housing boom in Spain and Ireland, and it can be argued that it's primarily because those countries were growing faster than the French and the Germans. So the ECB's monetary policy that is set as an average to cater for the average of the union was too easy for those countries, and that fueled the housing boom. Would you say that that's the...
Yeah, well, no, I agree with that. I spent the last 20 years talking about optimal currency area problems. The main criteria of which is if you don't have very flexible markets, then you have to have a great deal of symmetry, both in shocks and in structures. And it's obviously the case that this is what's happened. You've had a housing boom in, let's say, in Spain. Why is that? Because credit is cheap compared to what was historically the case. The interest rates are much lower. That happened because they moved from a not very strong economy with its own currency into the euro, where the average euro rate, which is set for correctly at the time for the average European economy, was much lower. So it's very cheap to borrow, and so you go into the housing business, and you know that sector expands. But of course, what it's really saying is that the fundamental equilibrium interest rate for Spain should have been higher than it actually was. And so what happens is you get a boom in the housing market in Spain. On the other side, going back a few years when Germany was doing really, really badly, so the earlier part of the 2000s, the fundamental equilibrium interest rate for Germany should have been actually lower than the euro average rate. And so you get a depression in the economy and a depression in the housing market. I speak from my mother-in-law's personal experience. House prices dip. So it's difficult to have one monetary policy which is going to cover both. And they have exactly the same problem now. It's got inverted. Spain is in dead trouble. I'm not sure if their economy is still contracting, but it probably is still contracting. And they've still got the debt problem, and the housing market has now collapsed, and all the rest of it. Whereas Germany has done various other things. The economy is doing relatively well. It's growing at 3 or 4%, which is a big number in the European context at the moment. And they've got inflation. They've got about 4% inflation in Germany, which is a complete no-no in German context. So the Germans need an interest rate rise, the Spanish need an interest rate fall, and they can't have it. The problem with I mean, the construction, you understand why a single monetary policy is wanted. You can understand why you want an independent central bank which is going to set this, and you understand why the interest rates that they're setting are going to be the average for the euro. The problem with an average is there's no guarantee anybody lives on the average. You know, you average between two extremes, and you've got an interest rate for the one in the middle. When I do it with my students, you've got a boom and a slump like that, so the cycles are exactly out of phase, and when you're at the top in one economy or at the bottom in the other, and what you're going to do with the interest rate. You can have the average, which is good for neither of them. You can have the high interest rate for the booming economy, which is rotten for the low economy, which is what they're getting, or you could have it the other way around. That's the problem. It's because the asymmetries are too strong.
Now, so I mean, given that we know all this, and obviously we've known all this even before the euro. There's a lot of theory going back 3 or 4 decades. But you were actually on an expert panel of academics that was that did an assessment on the government's view on whether the UK should adopt the euro. It was in early 2000s.
2002, yeah.
So what was the conclusion? how would it change now?
Oh, I'm not sure it would change greatly. The context was this was at the beginning of the second of the Blair governments, the Labour governments in London. So they had got re-elected in 2001. And Mr. Blair was very keen to go into the euro for the usual emotional reasons, but not for any great understanding of the economics. In fact, Martin Wolf, if you read his column in the FT, said Blair was probably the person who was least interested in economics in the entire world. He was interested in presentation and other things, so he wanted to go into euro for what I call emotional reasons. Gordon Brown, who was the finance minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, had a very different view, somewhat more founded in the economics of it. And so that had the potential of a big split in the government. And so the deal was Gordon Brown came up with 5 tests, not the Maastricht criteria, his own 5 tests on whether the euro could be thought to be beneficial for the UK economy. And I've actually forgotten the details of the tests, but they had a lot to do with asymmetries and a lot to do with interest rates, exchange rates, financial markets in London and things of this kind. So they did 6 or 9 months worth of research work in the Treasury in London on this, and produced a big report. And a function of the outside academics was to comment on particular aspects of it. So I was on asymmetries and interactions. And the conclusion of the report, at the end of it, 2,000 pages worth of report. I mean, it was a big thing, this big, was that Britain satisfied 1 out of the 5 tests, I think, and therefore shouldn't go ahead. And that's not terribly surprising, because if you look at the actual statistics, the British economy is actually significantly different from most of the European economies in structure, in market flexibility, in the way it functions. And so that seems to make considerable sense. And that was the end of that argument. If the 5 tests were done again today, I don't think the answer would be very different. I mean, London's position in the financial markets got hurt, but not because of the euro, but because of the, I regret to say, the RBS, Bank of Scotland. So the fundamentals are probably not very different. The politics, of course, has changed totally with the debt problem. There's not a great deal of sympathy for joining the euro now in Britain, or indeed in the 2 of the Scandinavian countries stayed out as well, and at the same story there. So
let's kind of go back to the future of the euro now. I mean, there's a number of scenarios that could be contemplated regarding the future of Greece and so on. So can we go through those? I mean, if Greece restructures, which is a nice word for default, can you see that it could potentially stay a part of the euro, or would it have to go back to drachmas? Or
well, no, it could. It could stay in the euro. And there's no reason why it can't do it. I mean, it has to take the pain, and it depends what form of pain you want and how quickly or slowly you want to have it. But I mean, it could restructure in that sense. The important point here is when most of the people in the media or when most of the politicians talk about this, they talk about restructuring, and they actually mean restructuring the debt, which means extending the maturity of the debt or some refinancing rollover arrangements, something called the Vienna Initiative. I'm not entirely sure what the different schemes are, but they're all to do with reforming the debt so that the severity of the problem goes away, or at least gets pushed down the road, as opposed to restructuring the economy. And if I was being asked to advise on this, I would say forget the debt. I mean, do whatever you have to do, but you need to restructure the economy. Because ultimately, the restructuring the debt, moving the problem down the road, doesn't solve the problem. It just takes the severity out of it from right now. So that there isn't a crisis in July, which they're expecting at the moment, when Greece has to say, I'm sorry, we can't pay back our debts at all, you've lost your money.
So that we can focus on the US debt crisis. So
we can focus on something else, yeah. But anyway, as far as a longer-term solution, then there has to be some restructuring of the economy, which involves, cutting in wages and costs and all the rest of it. And that's actually at least half of what's going on in terms of the riots in Athens at the moment, because when that happens, these particular interest groups get involved and are made to carry the cost. And it's painful, and it would take a long time. And the Germans had the same problem. When they had German unification in 1990, it put the economy out of business, in effect, from about 1994 to 2005. The growth rate was either zero or mildly negative. They had falling prices. They had massive unemployment. And for a long time, they resisted doing anything about it. When Helmut Kohl was Chancellor, he was always coming up with his, there's a pun on 39 points, but anyway, his 39-point plan about how it's going to be restructured. It would go into the Parliament, they would kick it out, and nothing ever happened. And then eventually the situation got sufficiently serious that the population agreed that something had to be done. And so it's a 10-year period, something like that. So it's very painful, but they could do it and stay in the euro doing it. Alternatively, they could go out of the euro. That's talked about a lot. I don't know how it would work in practice, because formally speaking, under all the treaties, there's no divorce law. You can't leave the euro, according to the treaties. But obviously, if it's sufficiently serious, the finance ministers and prime ministers can come together and say, well, we'll write a little treaty which says there's an exception for Greece. They're very reluctant to do it because politically it would be very damaging for a euro which is quite young, and politically, which bothers them more, it's very damaging because if they do it for Greece, there goes Portugal, there goes Ireland, and the whole thing might unravel. So politically it's very hard, and it's very hard for a country to agree to go out, because the game theory of this, if you understand my English, the game theory of this is that the Greeks have reckoned all along that getting in debt wasn't too bad a problem because somebody would bail them out. And they're right, somebody has bailed them out. And now they're betting on the fact that somebody will keep on bailing them out rather than let the unravelling of the euro happen. And that's exactly what's in the newspapers this morning. Sarkozy and Angela Merkel are meeting today to find out what to do. What they're going to do? Find some more money and continue to bail